I'm Robert McCready at Evening Magic on X, formerly known as Twitter. Lee Stockdale is retired military, a husband, a father, a poet, the son of the U.S. ambassador to Ireland. Met JFK, had a Coke with him, lives in the mountains, got an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte, won the United Kingdom National Poetry Prize and many other prizes. His book is called Gorilla, and he's my friend on Facebook and in real life. Lee Stockdale, thank you.
Great to be here.
It's great to be with you again, Lee. It's been a while, but I always enjoy talking to you. Where are you zooming us from right now?
I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, and I should say that we both went to the same MFA program at Queens. And Robert, of all the very talented people there, you made me laugh more than anyone else at the bar, over drinks. So I really appreciated our friendship and appreciate it now.
I feel the same way, and it was so coincidental because we have the same birthday, 11/3, and that was kind of cool because it's kind of rare. We also share it with Roseanne Barr and Dennis Miller and Anna Winter, the editor of Vogue.
Well, then I hate to disabuse you, but mine was November 5.
November 5. Oh no, I believed a lie all these years.
But that is my son's birthday, so it's very close.
Okay, I must have. I've been writing a lot of memoir lately, and memory changes, but you kind of just go with the memory like it's a fact. And I think that I did that.
I think that is sometimes what we do.
Right. So you wrote this book, Gorilla, and it is a lot of as poems about your life and a lot of them about your father, who
Yes,
was the U.S. ambassador to Ireland
under John F. Kennedy.
under John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
Have you always been a writer?
I actually always have been a writer. Yes. My mother was a poet, and where is her book? She has a couple books, but she wrote this book um, actually by the encouragement, if not direction, of John F. Kennedy, who told my father after we came back from Ireland. I was 8, 9, 10, 11, around there. And he said, I want Alice Boyd to write a book of poems for Ireland. And she said, you mean about Ireland? And Dad said, no, the chief was very clear. He wanted a book of poems for Ireland. So Mom wrote To Ireland with Love, and it's got a foreword by Senator Edward M. Kennedy, and there are blurbs on the back by Bing Crosby and Sean T.O. Kelly, um, who was a former president of Ireland, who I met. And there's a poem in here, Robert, about my meeting Sean T.O. Kelly, which if you'd like at some point I could read. But anyway, yeah, so I was writing early on. In fact, my mother, when I was in first grade, she and Mrs. Holman, my first grade teacher, recorded a 45 RPM of, quote, children's poems. The only one of which I could remember was Jabberwocky by C.S. Lewis. But I was enthralled with poetry, and so I was writing, early on as a kid.
Yeah, go ahead and read us that poem now.
Okay, I'm going to read you that poem now, and hope that I can find it. But you go ahead and talk for a while I because it's unfortunately, let's see, it's called Conversations at Roundwood. If I can find it here quickly. My mother was really a wonderful. There it is. It's that's what it looks like over here. So it's 3 stanzas. Conversation at Roundwood. And then I have an anecdote at the end of it. The older man, that's Sean T.O. Kelly, former president of Ireland, the older man, with arm around the younger, 80 years and 8 to be exact, was bringing a narrative of Irish history into the chair more quickening than fact. And tell me, sir, the voice piped, shy and thin, how many prisons were you really in? 7 in Ireland, 7 more in Britain. The accent dropped to a confidential tone. No, sighed the younger. Yes, replied the older. Faces closed. The world became their own. The troubled times were now, this very minute. Past and present merged, and they were in it. And just how many years was that in all? Let's see now. I would say 6.5. No, sighed the younger. Yes, replied the older. Every now and then the two would laugh. When Sean T.O. Kelly and Lee Stockdale parted, sure, one was wiser, one was lighter hearted.
Oh, that's nice.
Isn't that sweet? And that was at his home. We went to his home, wherever it was, out sort of in the country, as I recall. And though it's not in that poem, I asked him, I was 8, I said, do you believe in leprechauns? And he said, I've never seen a leprechaun, but I went one time into a cave and I found a leprechaun's clothes all laid out in the cave. So
There you have it.
there you have it, indeed.
Poetry is so mysterious to me, yet when I hear a poem, I know that it's a poem. And what you read from your mother was a poem. Where do poems come from?
That's such an interesting question. I was recently at a reading of Joseph Bethante's. Joseph Bethante, a wonderful North Carolina poet, uh, former poet laureate of the state of North Carolina, and he was reading from his new book, which is actually prose. I know him better as a poet, and I asked the question after his reading: what is different between your headspace for poetry or prose? And he said it's just that. Actually, it's kind of a headspace. I know that when I begin to write poetry, I am in a different headspace. I'm writing a novel as we speak. In fact, I've spent the last 6 hours or so writing on this novel, and it does put one into a whole different frame of mind. One must expand one's mind linearly in a way which, when I write poetry, I don't have to do. I'm not constrained in that way, and I can be more imaginative. And that's why there's a part of me that loves poetry more than any other kind of writing, because it can be so spontaneous. When I sit down to write a poem, I don't know what I'm going to write. I know Louise Glick has said the same thing, and I was cheered when I heard her or read that quote from her, that she doesn't know what she's going to write when she sits down, and so there is a difference, and I think anyone who writes both poetry and prose would say, it's a matter of what you sit down to do.
What does your poetry writing routine look like? Do you write by hand first and then type it? Is it just on the computer?
I have boxes and I have hundreds of tablets that I've long-handed, and then I would transcribe them onto a computer, and I have now a document of over 5,000 pages of poetry. Uh, most of it bad, but when I sit down now, I sit down at my laptop, and so I'm writing right into the laptop now, just because I think it makes it somewhat easier for me. I learned I started writing on a typewriter when I was about 13, so I'm used to using my fingers to write, in that way, on keys, on a keyboard. So I write on a laptop.
Is it the same for your novel?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion of, Julia Cameron, who insists that all writers do 3 pages longhand every morning?
I think that if that's her technique, I think that's a wonderful thing. it's not mine. I know when I'm sitting down, I'm at work. I mean, it's work. I don't wait. And I have friends, God bless them, as we say here in the South, who say, I don't write until I'm inspired. I'm just not that way. And nor do I typically have an idea for a poem. I just sit down and I think, okay, I'm working now. I'm working, and now I'm going to write. And so I write. I write a poem, or I write on my novel. So it's just work. But 3 pages of longhand, that's great. There's a poet. I don't know if you know Mary Ruefle. She does blackout or whiteout poems every morning, and that's taking any book, and typically she takes a book maybe from the 1800s, and she'll look at the pages and she whites out those words until on the page she believes that she has written, quote, written something, but she hasn't. She's just whited things out so that something is brought into relief, which for her is creative, and it is creative. I have one of her whiteout books, but she says she does that every morning. I mean, that's kind of an unusual and interesting way to start one's literary day.
I wonder if they're just warming up. And does every writer need to warm up? Are there any male writers that insist on this kind of warm up?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, Hemingway was apparently he was a very slow writer, methodical, but he would just write, and I think he didn't write that much per day. I think he said he would write 3 pages a day or something like that. I mean, everyone's got their own. And I think it was Michael Crichton or somebody who said that when he started writing, he would write and he would write every day, and he would have a tuna fish sandwich for lunch every day while he wrote. I mean, there are certain things that people do when they write. Now, I will tell you, I just got back. We live in Asheville, and I go down every day to the French Broad River and sit on the banks, and I write. I take a chair, and that's where I've been writing with my laptop. And so that's what I've been doing for the last month or so or more, just because I'm not at home. I'm not by the Wi-Fi. I don't get very good reception out there with my cell phone. So that's quote a technique I've had recently, which I'm able to use to block out, the stream of life that it can be a distraction for a writer.
The French Broad River is one of the few rivers of the world that flows north.
It does.
I think the Nile flows north, and there's one other one, and I don't remember what it is.
I know, and it's interesting. I was just telling my wife, I was by the river today, and 2 kayakers were floating by there. A lot of, and one said to the other, "Do you know this is one of the oldest rivers in the world?" And these mountains in Western North Carolina are apparently some of, if not the oldest mountains in the world. Very rounded, were once like the Rockies,
Mhm.
presumably, and now they're just rounded and just covered with trees, every inch now.
I hope they stay covered with trees because Asheville's been building up a little too much, and I want it to be beautiful forever.
It is beautiful.
Well, they can build one more house. It'll be my house, and
No.
no more. Well, moving on to your book, I made notes in here. Smell of new lumber on page
Yeah. Page 7,
six.
6.
Will you please read that?
Sure. Yes. Smell of new lumber. Lee Harvey Oswald murders JFK. My name, also Lee, does not help me not think I am in some way responsible for my father's death. Should have been at the window. No, Dad, stop. Wind in gray air wings, flapping to get back to the ledge. Was he thinking on the way down, this was a monumental mistake? About the smell of new lumber, our unfinished treehouse, going into that lumber yard, picking out boards, driving them home, sticking out the car window. Was he thinking, he'll finish it by himself? How hard can it be to hammer nails through wood?
That poem, I wrote 3 exclamation marks at the bottom of it. It was shocking in a bunch of different ways. Um, and I guess my question is, okay, so y'all really did buy wood that day or before, a couple days
We
before?
had bought wood and were in fact making a treehouse in the backyard.
And then um the thoughts that you put that you imagine he might be thinking during his suicide, his real life suicide for those watching, it was shocking because it seemed like people say when they have plans and someone kills themselves, like people that have plans don't kill themselves, or if they don't have a plan, then they might be suicidal, like a plan for their lives. And it made me just think, how cavalier of a decision it made. And it made me wonder if you thought there was maybe anything conspiratorial about your father's suicide. Are all your thoughts in this poem, or do you think that it was a suicide? Do you think that, like, are you comfortable with the fullness of that tragedy now?
Oh gosh, that is the mystery, and for your viewers, I need to explain that my father was a close friend of Jack Kennedy's, and 10 days after the assassination, my father committed suicide. Overcome by grief is how is the only way we could understand it and process it. Um, in later years, and that was, of course, 1963. In later years, in the 90s, for instance, my brother was in Washington, D.C. He was a journalist, and people were contacting him, saying for various reasons that they believed my father had been, in fact, murdered. That he was that it was part of the larger Kennedy assassination conspiracy. So, is that possible? It's possible. I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever know. I don't think I'll ever know, unless somebody comes out of the woodwork to confess, which I don't. It's been so many years that I don't think that's going to happen. But is it possible? Yes. Now, I do know, in fact, though, because I was there. I was young. I had just turned 11, November 5th, and he died less than a month later. He was terribly depressed. In fact, he flew up, and actually, I have it right here. It's so interesting. I gave a talk recently. Here's a telegram from Bobby Kennedy to my father the day of the assassination. The president's body will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House Saturday. That would have been tomorrow. You were invited to join in paying him respects from 2:30 to 5. Robert F. Kennedy. He did go up, Dad did, the next day, met with both Bobby and Teddy, and privately. And Teddy called my mother and said that Grant, my father's name, is terribly depressed. Well, Bobby and Teddy were depressed. So for Teddy to call my mother and say he's really depressed, he had to have been really depressed. And then, of course, I was there, and he was very depressed. Now, in that poem, I say I feel somewhat responsible. I guess in my mind, I must have thought, had I been able to, talk to him, reason with him, I guess I feel like I could have kept him from doing that. I mean, could I have? No, perhaps not. But I did feel responsibility, and it did not help that I happened to have the same name as the assassin, which for an 11-year-old, that really made me feel, some way connected to this thing in a real kind of spooky, evil way, which was not helpful to me.
And more connections, I recently helped Paul Leslie interview RFK Jr. And I don't know if you know much about it, but RFK Jr. does not believe, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Sirhan. He does not believe that he knowingly assassinated his father. And he thinks that either he was set up or he was drugged somehow. And they've become friends. I don't know if you knew this or not.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
Um, but that was my grandmother said, and she's no longer with us, but she said that two things changed America: the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and she said the acquittal of O.J. Simpson. She said those two things she saw changed the country in a way. So I can understand the story and the weight of JFK's assassination. Like I almost empathize with it enough that it was almost like I was there. I was listening to the stories and stuff. So I can imagine someone being close friends with him. If it affected America so much, I can imagine a close friend being overwhelmed with that.
Yeah.
A dark time. Um, your next poem that struck me was The Gift on page 16.
Yes. The gift.
Will you please read that one?
I shall. A church asked me to give a reading for Suicide Prevention Month. I'd also bring my mother's book, To Ireland with Love. I inherited copies when she died and purchase others when they come up on eBay. At random, I pulled out the book she'd inscribed for Ted, whom she'd met only days before and whom she'd marry a few days after, or a few weeks after that. Arriving early, I arranged the room and began to leaf through my mother's book. 50 years later, I feel anew the suicide wound in my mother's side. The dust jacket includes a family photograph. The 7 of us posed in Phoenix Park on the grass in the sun outside the ambassador's residence. In this copy she'd gifted for Ted, she had surgically scissored the family out.
That one shocked me because it was the whole family. And what I wrote, and I read this in May, these are my dates when I read it. I wrote, a new man and a new life. Maybe she only wanted him to see her. Does a woman, a wife, cut her baggage? A man brings baggage. Those are the questions I kind of, was she just like unburdening herself and say, oh, don't worry about all this drama. I can have a new husband.
I think you're right. I think that's exactly it. And in fact, I have the copy here, but I'll show you the picture.
Okay, and she's over there to the far right.
Yeah,
Okay.
but yeah, that was shocking to me. I mean, to sort of to have been thrust back into her headspace when she's meeting this new guy, who, by the way, I ended up just adoring. I loved my stepfather, and they were married for decades, and they were married within a month of finding each other, which was bizarre in itself. But yeah, she gave him this book, and I guess she was saying, look, that's in the past, as you've just said, and I'm ready for a new photograph, you know. But it was shocking to me standing there getting ready for this reading at a church, and really to feel all anew the grief that she felt, and I will say the anger and the bitterness. Now she would say she was never bitter, but you know, of course she was young. Gosh, she was like 40 years. Yeah, she was 40, and that's young when you've got 5 kids and your life ahead of you, and this wonderful man that you loved jumps out a window. Pretty shocking.
She got rid of all the kids though too. That's what is super shocking.
Yes, that's true. Thank you, Robert, for reminding me.
Oh, well, and it's weird to me because I'm the only child of a single mother, and so recently, and this is more personal than I've ever been on my show before, but you're bringing it out of me. When my grandmother died, she died fast. Like we found out she was sick. They were like, "Oh no, she's sick. Go to the emergency room." They're like, "Oh, she's got cancer everywhere." And then days later, she died.
Wow.
And I had this regret, like I should have spent more time with her. I should have not spent so much time writing. One summer, I was off all summer, and she called me. She said, "Are you writing a book?" And I was. I spent hours every day writing it. And I thought about that, and I just thought I should have spent more time with her. I should have gone over there so much that I couldn't stand going over, and she couldn't stand. That's what I wanted. I wanted to wear it out, the going over. And I was going through some of her drawers because we were looking for something that she wanted read at her funeral, something that she had written. And I saw some of the Valentine's cards that she'd given to my step grandfather. And she had written in them, I love I love our quiet Sunday afternoons just watching the race, just us working in the garden. And it made me feel so much better, like, oh, she's not just my grandmother. She enjoyed being a wife. And I was like, I'm glad I didn't bother them. But just being the only child of a single mom makes me think that I'm the center of everyone's universe, and not in a way like pay attention to me, but like I've got to be there for them. And it was a relief knowing that I wasn't. So when your mom cut all the kids out, I was like, does she still love Lee? And I don't know about your other siblings, but you got other ones. But for me, it's just identify with you and just Lee. But I like hearing now that you um, loved your stepfather. I think that's a beautiful thing. I'm glad to
Yeah.
know full
I'm
circle.
really glad that you picked that poem out because, and it's so interesting too when people say, oh, I love this poem or that poem, but no one has ever sort of singled that poem out. And it was, in fact, gosh, the book was picked up in December, and I wrote that poem in like September or October. So it was one of the last poems that I wrote before the book was accepted by a publisher. So it's really, it might be the most recent poem that I'd written for the book.
But it was affecting. It was affecting. And
I'm glad that it was. Yeah.
the last one that I made a note on was page 62 called Movie Theater.
Oh yes. I'm so glad. Now I will tell you, this got honorable mention for a Carl Jung um, contest, and I like this poem, and I'm glad you've picked it out because it's fun to me. Okay, movie theater. The ship sails into the sunset. A skull and bones flaps in the wind. The kidnapped boy looks back at the island as the head pirate laughs and startles the parrot. Tight shot on the green bottle that bobs in the waves, then washes up on the island beach. The boy awakes to his mother's voice. Timmy, get up, time for breakfast. Behold the bottle there on his nightstand. He reads the message inside, smiles. The end. The meager audience never sees the message. An ungratifying ending. They exit grumbling for these thin plot movies the owner runs in a theater that should have closed years ago, kept afloat only by unknowing snowbirds. He closes the theater and goes home to his attic room with sloping ceilings and mouse batting string in a corner. Speak, little mouse, what's on your mind? Do you want to be me and wear sandals and shorts? The man wants to be an acorn, fall from a tree, grow green hair, be a slow growth movie. He can hear them now. Give me back my money. He always does. He's commercially minded. One will die today. Don't let his last thought be that man who would not give me my money back. Let his last thoughts be of the wife he loved, the condo they enjoyed in Central Florida, how lucky he was to be born an American, how lucky to die on such a fine day.
That's great. It's hilarious. It's funny. And and you know what I wrote on this one? I wrote,
What?
"What film is this?"
That's funny you should ask, because in fact, my father and my brother and I went to the west coast of Florida, which was a big deal. We went fishing at a place called Bass Galore Village, near which was a tiny town. And we indeed went and saw this movie in which I fell asleep. I was young. I was probably 5 or 6 at the time. And but it was a big deal to go fishing with my big brother and my dad. And it was this crazy movie. I know I don't have the facts right, but in my mind, that was the movie. And so I envisioned it being played, and it was boring. But there's this, this projectionist, this owner of this movie theater.
Do you know the name of the movie?
You know, I don't, and I think I've seen it since on TV. And it's a pretty bad movie, but it still runs. It's about a kid, and I think there's a lamp, a magic lamp that he rubs and falls asleep or go. So it's kind of a kid movie, but it's kind of interesting.
Hmm. That is
It's a
interesting.
great memory.
Another interesting thing about you is that you're an American, and I think in America we look to England and the UK for the writers. And you, as an American, have been honored in the UK for their National Poetry Prize, which I love. But like, yeah, get some. We've conquered literature now. What else is there that we could conquer as an American? So, would you explain what that was like? How did that come about?
Oh gosh. Well, of course, I love the English writers. I love Shakespeare. I saw Hamlet last night, a production here in Asheville. And in fact, there's another one this weekend. The Tempest is being put on. I'm going to go maybe tonight or tomorrow. Um, but, I mean, who doesn't love the English writers? And so, yes, I knew that there was this competition, and I applied. I sent in a poem, and I was volunteering at the desk at church one Friday, and I got an email from a woman who said, we're looking at this poem. They've been, what did she, de-anonymized, and we want to know if this is your poem. Robert, it was a very interesting email. Is this your poem? Did you write it? Has it been published? Has it won any awards? Was it workshopped? The words, it's just like, did it depend on other poems? Do you stand by it as your own work? And I thought, well, gosh, yes. I mean, no one had ever seen it before, but myself and this competition. And I wrote back about 4 or 5 p.m., said, yes, it's mine. I remember writing it funny story about that. But no, there's a funny story about, because I was thinking, she said the poem, it was called My Dead Father's General Store in the Middle of a Desert is the title. And when I saw that title, I was thinking about a different poem, actually. I said, oh yeah, I remember having a lot of fun writing it. It was a different poem in my mind that I was thinking of, but it was my poem and I wrote it. So I got home and my wife and I were sitting in the living room about 8 p.m. and I got an email from this same woman, Judith Palmer, who I would get to know quite well, actually. And she said, you have won the National Poetry Prize. And I said, oh my God. And my wife was sitting there and she thought something bad had happened. She said, did someone die? I said, no, I've just won the United Kingdom National Poetry Prize. And Judith said, I've tried to call you, but I can't get through. But if you want to call me, you can call me, even if it's late. I called her. We chatted on the phone. And she said, and as you know, there's a figure, there's 5,000 pounds, which comes with it, which I didn't even realize, or I wasn't even thinking. I thought, wow, that's a wonderful thing. And she said, we would love it if you would come over on March 26th. And this was like February 1st. And she said, now you can't tell anyone. I said, okay, well, my wife knows. She said, well, you can't tell anyone. So I didn't tell anyone, and I couldn't tell anyone. And my son lives in London. In fact, we're going next week. He's marrying the British woman with whom he's had a relationship for the last few years. We're going back to England, and we were over there staying with them. And by this time, I've become friends with their public relations people and various people with the Poetry Society. And I said, well, we're staying with my son, Zach. Can I tell him? And they said, we'd rather you not. So, but then, we went and there were 10 people there. There were 8 honorable mentions. They all read. Then the third place read, and then the second place read. And I was like last man standing and went up and read this poem. And it was quite wonderful. It was just a wonderful experience, wonderful people. Really, Judith was fabulous, fabulous woman. And she said, now tomorrow I'd like to go take you to the BBC to be interviewed. And I said, well, that sounds great. And then we went to the BBC and I was interviewed there. That was very interesting. It was like trying to get into the Pentagon. They took my picture, gave me a badge, and very secure, big building. And then she was so kind, she and her assistant. I said, well, my wife and I are going tonight to a play. We were going to see, I forgot the name, the Mormon, Book of Mormon on the West End. And I said, I don't quite know where it is. And we want to eat. Do you know where we could eat? She said, well, I'm going to take you down there. Let's jump on a bus. So we got on a bus. And she was so kind, she was just so lovely. And she took me to a couple of different restaurants, said, well, I think you'd like this one. So wonderful people. They were just terrific. And the judges were great and generous to me. They were really, really wonderful people. With whom I'm now on Facebook. So we're friends and, that's fun.
Would you be willing to read that poem for us?
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to read it. My dead father's general store in the middle of a desert. It has gas pumps with red horses and wings, but is not merely a gas station. Your father is not my father, standing over me with a clipboard, checking off things done and left undone. He seems happy at this last stop before death for those living, before life for those not yet born, where his general store deals in flour, sugar, pieces of hacked meat or liver, reddish purple, a heart he wraps in brown paper. He cuts my hair beneath the tin awning, I must have gotten here from one direction or other on the road that stretches horizon to horizon, the desert heat shimmering my eyes into pools. I crawled in on my hands and knees. He handed me an ice-cold orange knee-high drink. It's pure coincidence that this store is my father's. I asked him where all this stuff comes from, as no trucks travel this road to replenish merchandise no one buys. He doesn't like questions that challenge his existence. I become quiet. He's cutting my hair and might consciously or unconsciously make me look bad. You're doing a great job out here, I say, which he knows is bullshit. How many fathers, even if they are dead, set up a general store in a desert? I persist. You keep the shelves stocked, floor broomed, bathroom clean. The more I talk, the more I encourage myself to love him for the trouble he went to making all this seem real. With cans of various sized nails, beans, rice, shelves of liquor, deli section with giant pickles. I begin to see what a dear, sweet man he is. Is this because he is dead? I wish he were alive again. I don't think he killed himself to be mean to me personally. At night, he says, howling coyotes come down from the mountains and leave notes, Bible verses, threatening messages, love letters, everything a coyote wants to get off its chest. I ask if they come every night. He says, without fail.
Was that based on a dream?
No, it just, it just wrote itself, as they say, just one line after another.
When I first read that, I I thought like you had a dream and this was just happened to be in the dream and you were getting to like work through something with your father when I first read it.
Yeah, I will say I was surprised that they selected it because I thought when I wrote it, I thought, you know, I love him. I wish he were alive again. Those are just sort of prosaic, they're just sort of overt expressions. And I thought, it's a personal poem. It probably will not resonate with others because it's so overt. I love him. I wish he were alive again. So it was really, I thought, quite surprising to me that they selected it. I'm glad they did, but you know, I'm glad they did because I like the poem, and even more important, my wife likes the poem, and my wife does not like a lot of what I write. She's not a poetry person at all. Period. So I was happy that she liked it.
What advice do you have to, let's just make it real personal, as personal poem. Let's give personal advice to me. I was
Sure.
not in the poetry cohort because I thought I'll write fiction and make a lot of money, and now I'm not making any money. So maybe I should have done the poetry cohort. So, what skills do you need? Or if I wrote the first draft of like a crappy poem, what should I be thinking about to make it better?
Um, well, I'm going to back up. I'm going to back up from that because if one wants to be a poet, I think one must just simply write and write and write and write. That's the first thing. Okay, so I mean, you just have to write and write and write, and finally, you know, become comfortable with a certain, level of your own comfort and feeling of authenticity. Now, to come down to your exact poem with that first draft, um, if you're happy with it, are you happy with it? I mean, is one happy with it? I read a poem at a reading Wednesday night. It was kind of experimental, but I'm a host of an open mic, and I wanted to make people feel that it was a welcoming kind of scenario where they could read anything. And so I read this, and it's authentic. It may not be a great poem, but I felt what I read, what I wrote. Um, and there's a wonderful poet, Patricia Smith, in whose workshops I have been. And I chatted with her, and I said, what about reading? What about when one reads? And she said, I want to know and feel and believe and trust that when a writer is reading what they've written, that they believe it and that they've got feeling in it and that they trust what they've written. So I write a first draft and I begin revising it immediately. um, I might revise it for another 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. You know, um, I don't know if I spend a lot of time on a poem. I mean, I was listening once to um, I was at the Library of Congress. I had the opportunity to sit for a month and listen to poets of the New York School through the St. Mark's and the Bowery Poetry Project. My job, for which I was getting paid, was to listen to their poems audio, and then they would say, and the poem of this is The Oak. And then I would look and see where it was and say, okay, The Oak, and I would type that stuff in. I was listening to Alice Notley's workshop, and she said, look, a poem takes about 40 minutes to write. And I think that's about right. Now I hear people say, I've been working on this poem for years. A poem which they'll bring out and take out, and but like the poems in the book that I wrote, I think they're all pretty much where they are. I don't know if Robert Frost would go back and say, whose woods these are. Can I change that line? I mean, I think once you've written it, but there was a writer, and I forgot his name, gosh, but he was at our MFA program. I liked what he said and it was about prose, but he said something like, after you've written something you've written, you should really be like nervous about sending it out and not feel comfortable. And I understood what he said. I'm not doing it as well as he did, but so that there's a risk. There's a risk in what one has written. Has one taken a risk? So I think I'm writing a lot of humorous poems now. And the poems in Gorilla, they were very tough to write. Many of them very tough to write. The Smell of New Lumber, which I read, the first poem I read tonight, that was a hard poem to write. But I wrote it. But it was a hard poem to write. And I've gotten through a lot of those kinds of poems, and I'm writing poems that are, more fun, some humorous poems. And so, yeah, I don't sit down to write a humorous poem, but I don't sit down to write a, sort of a deep poem either. If it just comes, but they can turn, they turn like that. And that's a really good poem. Billy Collins talks about the turn in a poem about three quarters down, a sonnet, sonnet turns at the end. But if they do, they do. You can't force it, but that's a hell of a long answer to your question. It's a good question, though. I don't know if I could help anyone be a good writer. I think you just have to keep writing.
I like what you said though about being happy with what you wrote and being authentic, and I appreciate that. And it was Pinckney Benedict that talked about,
That's who it was. That's who it was.
yeah.
Pinckney Benedict. And I said to Pinckney one time, we were in a car going to a restaurant or a bar or something after classes. And I said to him, gosh, with a name like Pinckney Benedict, you could only have been a writer. Isn't that a great name?
It is a great name. I once Googled him, and I think his family, like yours, is in government. He's got a
That
long
doesn't
West
surprise
Virginian
me.
history.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
So this is the final question.
Yes.
Paul Leslie, who runs a great podcast called the Paul Leslie Hour, always gives the last question over to the interviewee. That way that he gives the microphone to the interviewee. That way the person being interviewed can say whatever is on his heart and his mind, knowing that the message is going to go out across all of America and the UK. This is for everyone listening, Lee
And China.
Stockdale.
And China.
Hopefully they can understand. so, so I'm turning over the microphone to you.
Okay. Okay. I wasn't ready for this, but here's what's on my heart. And that is I'm just so grateful. I am so grateful for the opportunity to write. And I don't just mean, the time that life has allowed me at this stage of my life to write, but I'm just so grateful that these vehicles exist. I mean, you think of Picasso. What if Picasso? I'm not comparing, but just for the craft aspect, I'm not comparing myself to Picasso. But what if Picasso was Picasso, but painting didn't exist? Painting didn't exist. The craft of the art of painting did not exist. Or Van Gogh. What would those guys have done? Or Joan Mitchell. And so I'm so grateful that the crafts of fiction and poetry exist that allow us writers to express themselves. Now, I'm going to say this. I have an open mic at a place called Arts Upstairs Art Space, and someone got up and read. He's not a writer, but he read about coming out, and his husband was in the audience, and it was so. He's not a writer at all, but he wanted to get up and express his love, the pain. His father would not meet his husband for 20 years, and then his mother, when the father died, said, "I embrace you." And for 8 years there was this family relationship. But the point though is, that was a risk. That was a risk that this friend of mine took. I mean, he's a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, and they both are. And so I'm just so grateful for the opportunity he had to express something that I don't think there's any way he could possibly have expressed this except through the craft of poetry. And so, I'm such a grateful person. I have a deep faith in God, or whatever one wants to call it, however one wants to get there, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, or nothing, naturalism. I'm just so grateful. I have such gratitude, and I'm so hopeful that comes through in my work, and so that's what I have to say. That's my last thing.
Thank you so much, Lee Stockdale.
This has been a lot of fun.